Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction, Asia. It's actually not... thank you, Elisa. It's actually not that long ago, although the work has been going on for a while, that Asia and Elisa contacted me and said they were interested to spearhead a pilot of crowdsourcing at EU level, which, of course, sounds very ambitious.
Yeah.
And this, of course, would be the basis of Article 11 of the Lisbon Treaty, which envisages that there is a proper dialogue with the citizens and citizen participation in decision-making. And so the question was, and it was a good question, well, why can we not set up and have a pilot of crowdsourcing at EU level? One of my first questions, which Elisa started to answer earlier as well, is, well, what exactly do we mean by crowdsourcing? I quite like this definition from Brabham: an online distributed problem-solving and production model that leverages the collective intelligence of online communities to serve specific organisational goals. Which sounds great, but it's not very specific, is it, in terms of taking us to what a pilot could look like? And of course, there are all of the issues. I mean, we've all heard about, or maybe even complained about, this so-called democratic deficit, and so we know that the problems are there, and that if there's a way we could bridge that, this apparent gap between citizens and a political elite, this so-called lack of representativeness and participation. But of course, with all of that, we also have to keep in mind that, well, any kind of a pilot, anything that you can think of in terms of changing the decision-making process at the EU level, it's going to be quite controversial. Member states are going to be quite suspicious, potentially, of anything that might be seen to cede influence. Politicians may be a little bit fearful of how this would feed into a populist agenda. And plus another issue as well is that crossed my mind, well, if we want to start involving the crowd in EU decision-making, a lot of EU legislation is highly technical. I work in competition law, and I can't imagine how something like the EU merger regulation would be crowdsourced. So, with all of these issues, but with the potential benefits, we set out on this project. One thing which was important at the outset, and which is set out in the paper, is, well, what do we think a successful crowdsourcing pilot would look like? And here we have a specific set of objectives, which I think capture it very well, that in order to be successful, a pilot crowdsourcing, or crowdsourcing for the future, would have to enhance citizen participation in policy making, ensure representativeness, engage the youth, ensure a learning process, and I think that's key as well. There has to be a net benefit here, and involve innovative ideas and increased political legitimacy and trust, and go some way towards restoring citizens' faith in crowdsourcing as a method of democracy. And so I think it's really important, though, that we keep that in mind, because I think it's very easy to get over the first hurdle or question of thinking, well, is crowdsourcing a good idea? Well, yes, but we shouldn't assume the benefits. And actually, if we think of what efforts have been made in the past, whether they're crowdsourcing or other forms of citizen participation, they can often get bogged down in quite a lot of difficulties. And that was actually the next step of the question in this process of, well, if we want to have crowdsourcing, why not start with what we've got? There are already some tools there. Why not work with them and try to improve them? The European Citizens' Initiative might be the obvious starting point, but it has been very widely criticised, and in some ways I think the statistics speak for themselves. There have only been 3 successful examples and 29 unsuccessful examples so far. It's seen as a very long and burdensome process. So I think two things are important there for a pilot. One is, this doesn't work. But number two, we have to think, well, why doesn't it work? And this does not deliver that list of objectives. Any pilot will have to. Similarly, and as introduced by Elisa a bit earlier, public consultations and petitions to the Parliament, these methods are not really suitable for a crowdsourcing experience. And so that's why this paper that ECAS has published is very much geared at, well, no, we need something new. We need to go back to the drawing board here. And so to the research that has been carried out. So 27 examples from around the globe have been researched. They've been assessed according to the criteria that are set out here. And overall, it's been a lot of positive examples of how crowdsourcing can make a difference. And maybe just to give you a flavour of it, if I mention two of them. So one of the examples involved was in the Philippines, where there was a lot of reaction and criticism of a Cybercrime Prevention Act. And following on from that, a kind of an own initiative of the crowd began between a number of bloggers in the Philippines who were interested to force the agenda around internet freedom, data protection, and kind of ensure best standards there. And from this online collaboration emerged a text which subsequently went on and came into the hands of a senator and became the basis of a bill in the Philippines, which is now, I understand, going through the processes there. So a really great example of how those with the best knowledge can share that knowledge via online platforms and actually deliver a very concrete change to the law. There are some drawbacks from it. It was quite a specialised example. Not everyone is going to be an expert in what would be appropriate data protection limits. And secondly, this very much relied on existing platforms. So they were sharing via existing means of social media. And I think we can all imagine that if there were going to be ever a sustainable crowdsourcing solution at EU level, it could not rely on existing social media methods, because it would be too open to fraud and to spam, etc. Another very successful example, which was also quite typical of the examples that we found to be successful in these examples, came from Paris, where since I think 2014 there has been an initiative to involve the citizens of Paris in deciding how budgets will be allocated. It's relatively defined. The budget is already set, and the spread of projects that this money can be used for is already predetermined to a large extent. But via online tools, citizens have the opportunity to say, well, I would like this project seen through compared to that project. It's very neat, and it works well, I think, because it's quite binary. It's budgetary allocation, it's quite a defined, discrete question. And so that works very well, and that was typical of what we found in the examples, that something quite binary like budgetary allocation tended to work very well, whereas other more complex forms of decision making are more difficult to put to the crowd. So that's just a snippet of the two examples. So indeed, some things worked well, some things need to be improved, but of course the key question for a pilot is, well, can all of this be transposed to the EU level with all of the complexities of EU law? So the next thing we turned ourselves to was to think, well, what could be the possible policy fields? What would make a suitable policy for crowdsourcing at the EU? And here we also carried out an exercise to look at the whole spectrum of EU policy making and consider, well, could we imagine that there's something in this that could be put to the crowd and that there would be sufficient wisdom from the crowd to inform decision making here? It was a little bit of a hypothetical exercise because, for example, we did not consider whether or not particular policies, decisions, etc. are coming up for renewal or due to expire. We set that aside and just imagined it hypothetically, could this area of law be suitable? One thing that was an important yardstick for us was the extent to which citizens might be engaged in the issues. So is it something that, for example, scores high on the EU Eurobarometer, or something that from other research, including research that ECAS has been carried out, suggests that citizens feel strongly about? We also had to have regard to the level of technicality, so something that would be too technical arguably would not be suitable, or something that would require expert input. And we also had some regard to issues that might be considered too political, and arguably, thank you, immigration, and even though citizens might feel very strongly about it, it may not be suitable for a pilot because there could be a lot of opposition from organised interest. I won't go through all 5 of these that we identified as suitable candidates. I'll give the floor to others. But maybe just to mention, maybe I just mention one for now. So employment and social policy. Here, EU competence for this area of law comes from the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Articles 45 to 55 and 145 to 164. And there is a whole range of recommendations, guidelines, regulations, directives that have been adopted by the EU in this area of law, which seek to regulate everything from health and safety issues to working time. And so, for example, there are guidelines on employment policies which set out a direction for member states' employment policies in order to achieve certain strategic objectives at EU level. There is a recommendation on long-term unemployment. There is a working time directive, and there is a directive on health and safety requirements. And it seemed to us that this area, this is something where the crowd have, number one, a lot of relevant experience, and you could conceive that there is a gap there that could be filled. There is knowledge there that could be passed on to politicians. Some issues may be a bit too technical and require some expert input, particularly around health and safety. But nevertheless, we thought that formed a potentially suitable candidate. The others, maybe we come to them in the discussion. You'll also find them summarised in the publication that ASIA has presented. The other question is, of course, so if we identify a policy area, maybe even a specific instrument that we think could form a useful pilot, how do you want to go about implementing actually a crowdsourcing solution? And here we are still, this is still, I think it's fair to say, at the beginning of the thinking process. I think for a pilot, it's fair to say that, we don't have crowdsourcing legislation at the EU. There is no, if you imagine the whole EU decision-making process from the initiation of an idea to the implementation of a measure, there is no existing means whereby citizen participation in an organised crowdsourcing way can be inputted into that. So possibly it would have to be, for a pilot, engineered around some of the existing points of entry, for example, via the European Parliament, who can, of course, go to the Commission as the originator of legislation and put a proposal there. But that's something that does require a bit more thought, and it's both a conceptual issue and also it's a technological issue, because you have to imagine that behind all of this will lie an IT platform that will somehow connect the citizens and the crowd to form an idea, to form an input into the legislative process. In due course, I think crowdsourcing, if it were to have its fullest expression, would have to involve legislative change in the EU. It would, and if the crowd were going to be involved at all levels of the decision-making process, including in particular the real decision-making, whether that's in the Council or the Parliament, and particular and specific points of entry would have to be identified and legislated around for all of that. So that was all I was going to say by way of introduction to the work that has been carried out. As you see, it's very much a work in progress. A lot of, I think, what has been achieved so far is to identify a lot of the key questions, and the next stage is definitely a further level of review on all of this.